Welcome back to building and maintaining long-term brain health. In the last video, I shared with you how your brain is wired to react under stress, and how this often causes what Daniel Goleman called emotional hijackings. Well, let's look now at how this impacts your long-term brain health and even how you make decisions. First, long-term stress causes degeneration in the area of the brain responsible for self-control. Now, we've seen this during the pandemic and during the lockdowns, particularly after 2 or 3 months of the first lockdowns, before we sort of kind of got used to it. We started reading about binge eating and alcohol abuse and even family abuse, whether it was spousal abuse or abuse of children. And that's because, again, the part of the brain responsible for our self-control literally degenerates. It literally gets smaller. It shrinks from long-term stress, prolonged long-term stress. And that's what we were all going throughout the pandemic and throughout the lockdowns and try to get out of lockdowns and then go back into lockdowns and the uncertainty over the economic conditions. So this was actually a physiological response to the COVID pandemic by our brains. Now, secondly, stress overloads our short-term memory, which is the working memory part of our brains. And this working memory is what helps us remember things when we need to do tasks, such as type in the URL address of a website or remembering our user ID and password access codes. And I'm sure most of you experienced during the pandemic and during the lockdown, many of you experienced, I can't remember what that website's called, or I can't remember what my password is, and getting very frustrated. And that's, again, because stress was overloading your short-term memory, or what's called your working memory. Now, stress also causes a flood of neurohormones to rush to the prefrontal cortex. Remember, the prefrontal cortex is at the front of your brain. And these neurohormones impair the processing function of your prefrontal cortex. And it leads to fewer neurons being fired in the thinking part of your brain and more neurons being fired off in the emotional center of your brain. Remember, that's the amygdala at the back. So again, more neurons firing in the emotional center. It's one reason why you were being more emotional. Emotions were impacting your decision-making rather than the rational part of your brain. Now, stress can also have a direct impact on your decision-making process and the decisions that you make. For instance, feeling stress changes how people weigh risks and weigh rewards during their decision-making process. Now, surprisingly, at least to me, under stress, people have a natural tendency to pay more attention to positive information and thus to focus on the way outcomes could go right. Now, I should have known this instinctively because I grew up in Las Vegas. And this is why more and more hotels and casinos get built, because people are under stress or any heavy emotion. So even happiness, having a good time. People in a casino, they're under stress. They keep thinking, okay, even though I've lost 3 or 4 hands in a row, I'm bound to win the next one. And so they keep betting, they keep gambling, and the odds don't change. Just because you've lost 3, 4, 5 hands in a row, the next hand has the same odds of winning or losing as the first hand. And as we all know, those odds are in the house favor. But interestingly, research now shows that people under stress have a natural tendency to pay more attention to positive information and thus focus on the way that outcomes could go right. Think about that the next time you're making a decision. How are you weighing the risks? How are you weighing the rewards? And are you leaning more towards that positive side or not? There are also gender differences in play as well. And yes, this is stereotypical information. However, it is scientifically researched information. And it shows that under stress, men have an increased tendency and willingness to take risks, while under stress, women have an increased tendency and willingness to be more conservative about risk. Now think about that. If you're in the workplace and you have 4 people on some cross-functional task group, 2 men and 2 women. And again, look, everyone's individual and they may or may not live up to the stereotypes, but research would say that typically if you had 2 men and 2 women trying to make a decision about taking risks, the 2 men would have a tendency and willingness to take more risk, while the 2 women on the team would be a little bit more conservative about risk. And think about how that might impact the decision-making process. Additionally, new managers and new supervisors, as well as entrepreneurs, tend to resort to micromanaging when under increased stress. Now, no one in the workplace wants to be micromanaged. Maybe fresh new college graduates in their first job, they love being micromanaged because they're like a dry sponge. They soak up all the information they can. But everyone else in the workplace, very, very few people, if any, want to be micromanaged. So if you start to be under stress and you start to micromanage your team, not only does that decrease their productivity, but it's also going to have a negative impact on your relationship with them. And lastly, as I mentioned in a previous video, stress causes the brain to resort to binary decision making. It tries to limit our choices to only two, A or B, black or white, this or that, one or two, whatever it happens to be. And this is not ideal when you need to consider multiple options, particularly in those major decisions that you need to make. You know, a few years ago, my girlfriend faced a situation where she literally froze in making a decision. She was being pulled in several different directions. Her mom wanted her to do one thing. Her son wanted her to do another thing. And quite frankly, I had a different preference for something that she should do. And she couldn't please us all. And this put her under tremendous stress. And she kept thinking, though, that she only had two choices, A or B. And when I realized what she was going through and she was in this binary decision-making mode, I told her, we were in the car accident. I told her, pull over, just stop. Stop and think about all the other possibilities, all the other options that might be available before you make this decision. This purposely shifted her from binary thinking into looking at this huge range of possibilities. And eventually she came up with an idea and decision that made everybody happy. Most importantly, herself. So when you find yourself just limiting your options to two, realize that you're under stress. Realize this is a natural tendency of your brain and stop. Force yourself to consider other options. Force yourself to pause your decision-making process. Okay, another tip. In addition, overwhelming stress causes the brain to shift instinctively to survival mode. And this often leads to behaviors, actions, even verbal outbursts, which do not fit the circumstances, nor, quite frankly, do they alleviate the situation. The reactionary nature of these emotional meltdowns often makes the situation worse, thus increasing stress for everyone involved. So again, under stress, realize what the stress or anxiety or whatever emotions that you're feeling, understand how they're impacting your brain. So as you can see, stress has many ways of negatively impacting your brain. In the next video, I'll share with you some ways to control and manage your brain when you're under stress. How to get control of your brain back again, get back to rational control so you're not making emotional decisions. Okay? I'll see you in the next video.